Ethan Caldwell stepped off the private jet, his designer sunglasses perched on his nose, and a smug grin plastered across his face. He was in London, the city of royalty, history, and most importantly to him, Instagram-worthy moments. Ethan wasn't just rich, he was obnoxiously rich. The kind of guy who wore tailored suits to casual brunches and tipped waiters more than most people made in a week. But wealth wasn't enough for Ethan. No, he craved something else. Attention. Lots of it. And what better place to get it than in one of the most iconic cities in the world? As soon as he landed, Ethan wasted no time diving into his whirlwind itinerary. His days were packed with visits to famous landmarks, the Tower of London, Big Ben, the Shard, but none fascinated him quite like Buckingham Palace. There was something about the grandeur of the building and the stoic royal guards stationed outside that captured his imagination, or rather, his sense of mischief. To Ethan, these guards weren't real people with lives and responsibilities. They were props, part of the scenery designed to make his photos pop. On his second day in the city, Ethan found himself standing at the gates of Buckingham Palace, snapping selfies with the guards in the background. The tourists around him whispered in awe, marveling at the precision of the changing of the guard ceremony. But Ethan wasn't impressed. "They're just standing there," he muttered to himself, rolling his eyes. "How hard can it be?" His tone was dismissive, almost mocking, as if centuries of tradition could be boiled down to nothing more than standing still. That evening, after a decadent dinner at an upscale restaurant, Ethan met up with some acquaintances from New York who happened to be in town. Over glasses of champagne, the conversation turned to pranks and stunts. One friend joked about throwing eggs at statues, while another bragged about sneaking into restricted areas during their travels. Ethan listened intently, his mind racing with ideas. A challenge sparked in his eyes, a mischievous glint that signaled trouble brewing. When someone jokingly dared him to do something outrageous, Ethan's competitive streak kicked in. "I'll do it," he declared, leaning back in his chair with a cocky smirk. But not eggs or spray paint. Something bigger, something unforgettable. His friends laughed, thinking he was bluffing. But Ethan wasn't kidding. By the end of the night, he'd already started planning his next move. After all, he thrived on chaos, especially when it came with a side of internet fame. Little did he know, however, that this particular stunt would change everything, for better or worse. The following morning, Ethan wandered through the streets of London, stopping by an art supply store. He picked out cans of bright red paint, humming to himself as if he were preparing for a harmless arts and crafts project instead of something far more reckless. Locals eyed him curiously, but Ethan didn't care. In his mind, rules were meant to be bent or broken, and consequences were for other people. As he walked back toward Buckingham Palace, the weight of the paint cans in his hands felt oddly satisfying, like he was holding the key to his next big adventure. Or so he thought. What Ethan failed to realize was that actions have repercussions, even for someone as privileged as him. And as he approached the palace gates once again, his confidence masking any hint of doubt, he was about to step onto a path that would lead to regret, shame, and a life-altering lesson. The next morning, Ethan woke up with a strange mix of excitement and nervous energy buzzing through him. He couldn't stop thinking about the plan he'd hatched the night before. Pouring paint on a royal guard. It was bold, ridiculous, and just outrageous enough to grab attention. To Ethan, it wasn't vandalism. It was performance art. At least, that's how he justified it in his head. He didn't care about the history or tradition behind the guards' uniforms. All he cared about was making a splash, literally, and turning heads online. After grabbing coffee from a trendy cafe near his hotel, Ethan headed straight to an art supply store. The shopkeeper raised an eyebrow when Ethan walked in, scanning the aisles for the brightest colors available. "What are you working on?" she asked casually as Ethan picked up several cans of red paint. "Oh, just something creative," Ethan replied with a sly grin, avoiding eye contact. He didn't want to give too much away, not because he felt guilty, but because he loved the idea of keeping people guessing. Mystery, after all, added to the drama. By the time he left the store, Ethan's phone was already blowing up with messages from his friends back in New York. They'd heard snippets of his plan and were egging him on, sending memes and laughing emojis. "Do it, man." One text read, "This is going to be epic." Another friend joked, "Just don't get arrested, or do, I guess. Either way, it'll be hilarious." Their encouragement only fueled Ethan's ego further, pushing him closer to the edge of recklessness. As he strolled toward Buckingham Palace, Ethan noticed locals giving him curious glances. Some seemed amused by the sight of a well-dressed American carrying cans of paint, while others looked concerned. One elderly woman stopped him briefly, her voice gentle but firm. "Those guards work very hard," she said. "They're not here for entertainment, young man." Ethan forced a polite smile and nodded, pretending to listen, but inside, he dismissed her words entirely. What did she know? She wasn't part of his world, a world where rules were flexible and consequences rarely stuck. When Ethan arrived at the palace gates, he took a moment to observe the scene. Tourists snapped photos, children pointed excitedly, and the guards stood tall, unmoving, their bright red coats and bearskin hats striking against the gray London sky. Ethan zeroed in on one guard in particular, a young man named James Harper. There was something about James's posture that caught Ethan's attention. It wasn't just discipline, it was pride. But to Ethan, that pride was nothing more than an opportunity. He circled the area a few times, waiting for the perfect moment. His heart raced, partly from adrenaline, and partly from nerves. For all his bravado, there was a flicker of doubt in the back of his mind. What if someone tried to stop him? What if security intervened? But Ethan quickly pushed those thoughts aside. He told himself he was untouchable, shielded by his wealth and status. If things went south, he could always call his lawyer or throw money at the problem. That mindset had gotten him out of trouble before, so why wouldn't it work now? Finally, Ethan made his decision. With a deep breath, he stepped forward, clutching the can of paint tightly in his hand. The crowd around him grew louder, some tourists whispering among themselves, wondering what this oddly dressed man was up to. Ethan ignored them, focusing solely on James. As he approached, he could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on him, watching, waiting. For a split second, he hesitated, but then he reminded himself of the likes, shares, and comments that would flood his social media accounts once the video went live. That thought alone was enough to silence any lingering doubts. Ethan didn't realize it yet, but this single impulsive act would set off a chain reaction he couldn't have predicted. In his mind, it was just another prank, another way to prove he was fearless and untouchable. But the world and James had other plans, and as Ethan prepared to pour the paint, he failed to notice the growing tension in the air, the quiet murmurs of disapproval, and the sharp intake of breath from those who understood the gravity of what he was about to do. Ethan's fingers trembled slightly as he unscrewed the cap of the paint can, the metallic scent of fresh paint filling the air. He glanced around, suddenly hyper-aware of the dozens of eyes on him. Tourists paused mid-photo, their cameras lowering ever so slightly as they realized something unusual was about to happen. A few parents instinctively pulled their children closer, unsure whether to intervene or simply watch. The atmosphere shifted from cheerful curiosity to uneasy anticipation. But Ethan ignored it all. His focus was razor-sharp, locked onto James Harper, the young guard standing like a statue before him. James, for his part, didn't flinch. Not when Ethan stepped closer, not when the first drip of red paint splattered onto his pristine uniform, and certainly not when Ethan tilted the entire can, letting the liquid cascade down his chest and over his polished buttons. To an outsider, James might have seemed emotionless, but there were subtle signs of tension, a slight tightening in his jaw, a faint twitch in his hands behind his back. These were details Ethan missed entirely, blinded by his own bravado and self-importance. As the paint flowed freely, Ethan couldn't help but chuckle. It wasn't just amusement, it was triumph. In his mind, this moment was already viral gold. He held up his phone, filming every second, narrating with exaggerated enthusiasm. "And there we go," he announced to no one in particular, his voice loud enough to carry across the crowd. "Royal shade activated. How's that for a souvenir?" Some onlookers gasped. Others muttered angrily under their breath. But Ethan soaked it all in. To him, the murmurs of disapproval only added fuel to the fire. Controversy meant clicks, and clicks meant validation. But what Ethan failed to notice was the ripple effect spreading through the crowd. While some laughed nervously, assuming it was part of some elaborate prank, others looked genuinely horrified. One man, an older British gentleman clutching a guidebook, shook his head in disbelief. "This is disgraceful," he muttered, his tone sharp enough to cut glass. A woman nearby nodded in agreement, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Even the children, who moments earlier had been giggling at the novelty of the guards' uniforms, now stared wide-eyed, unsure whether to cry or cheer. Meanwhile, James remained perfectly still, adhering to protocol despite the chaos unfolding around him. Inside, however, his emotions churned like a storm. This wasn't just paint staining his uniform. It was disrespect, plain and simple. Every drop felt like mockery, a slap in the face to years of training, discipline, and sacrifice. For James, being a royal guard wasn't just a job. It was a calling, a way to honor his country and provide for his family. And now, here was this stranger, this reckless tourist, treating it all like a joke. The crowd began to murmur louder, their initial shock giving way to anger. Someone shouted, "You shouldn't have done that." Another voice joined in, "Do you even know what these men represent?" Ethan brushed off the comments, waving dismissively, as if swatting away flies. "Relax, people," he said with a smirk. "It's just paint, no harm done." But deep down, he felt the first flicker of unease. The reactions weren't quite what he'd expected. Sure, he'd anticipated some backlash, maybe a few scowls or eye rolls. But this felt different. The weight of collective disapproval pressed down on him, though he refused to let it show. Finally, after what felt like an eternity but was really only a minute or two, Ethan stepped back, admiring his handiwork. James stood motionless, the vibrant red streaks contrasting sharply against his otherwise immaculate appearance. Ethan grinned, holding up his phone to capture one last shot. "All right, folks," he announced, turning to the crowd. "Show's over. Don't forget to follow me for more adventures." With that, he turned on his heel, strutting away as if he'd just conquered the world. What Ethan didn't see as he walked off was the sea of glares following him. Nor did he notice the group of tourists approaching James, offering tissues and words of support. He also missed the quiet determination in James's eyes, hidden beneath layers of professionalism. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. As Ethan disappeared into the throng of people, oblivious to the storm brewing behind him, James silently vowed to ensure that justice would be served. Within minutes of Ethan's stunt, the video he posted online began to spread like wildfire. At first, it seemed like the reaction was exactly what he had hoped for. Comments poured in, likes skyrocketed, and his follower count ticked upward at an alarming rate. "OMG, this is hilarious," one user wrote, while another added, "Bold move, dude." Ethan couldn't help but bask in the attention, refreshing his notifications obsessively as he strolled through London, still clutching the now empty paint can. For a brief moment, he felt invincible, convinced that his prank had cemented his status as the ultimate provocateur. But social media is a fickle beast, and the tide turned faster than Ethan could have imagined. What started as amusement quickly gave way to outrage. People began to scrutinize the video more closely, noticing the stark contrast between Ethan's smug demeanor and James's stoic professionalism. Comments shifted from laughter to anger. "This isn't funny. It's disrespectful," one person typed. Another chimed in. "These guards represent centuries of tradition. How dare he treat them like props?" Before long, hashtags like #RespectTheGuard and #ShameOnEthan began trending, turning the incident into a global conversation about privilege, entitlement, and cultural sensitivity. News outlets picked up the story almost immediately, amplifying the backlash. Headlines blared across newspapers and websites. "American tourist defaces royal guard in tasteless stunt." "Wealthy visitor sparks outrage at Buckingham Palace." And "Is this the end of respect for tradition?" Journalists dissected every detail of the incident, interviewing historians, military experts, and even former royal guards who condemned Ethan's actions as not just disrespectful but deeply offensive. One historian described the guards' uniforms as symbols of national pride, likening Ethan's behavior to desecrating a flag. The comparison struck a nerve, fueling even more criticism. As the day wore on, Ethan began to notice the shift in tone both online and in person. Strangers glared at him when he passed by, some muttering under their breath or shaking their heads in disgust. A group of tourists stopped him near Trafalgar Square, demanding to know why he thought it was acceptable to humiliate someone simply doing their job. "It was just a joke," Ethan stammered, trying to defend himself, but his words fell flat. Even his friends back home, who had initially encouraged him, started deleting their supportive messages and distancing themselves publicly. The same people who had egged him on were now silent, unwilling to associate with the growing controversy. Meanwhile, James Harper became an unexpected hero. Social media users rallied around him, praising his composure and dignity in the face of such blatant disrespect. Someone created a fan page dedicated to James, sharing photos of him in uniform and highlighting his backstory. A young man from a modest background who joined the military to support his family. Donations poured into a charity James supported, with fans vowing to honor his service by giving back to causes he cared about. Overnight, James went from being an ordinary guard to a symbol of resilience and grace under pressure. Back in his hotel room, Ethan scrolled through the mounting criticism, his confidence crumbling with each passing hour. His phone buzzed nonstop with notifications, but instead of likes and shares, it was flooded with hate messages. "You're a disgrace," read one comment. "Go back to your money. It won't save you this time," said another. Sponsors who once clamored to work with him began issuing statements cutting ties, citing values that didn't align with Ethan's behavior. Brands dropped him faster than he could respond, leaving his inbox filled with formal emails severing partnerships. Ethan tried to laugh it off at first, telling himself that negative attention was still attention. But as the hours dragged on, the weight of the backlash became impossible to ignore. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that his actions had consequences far beyond a few angry comments. He hadn't just offended one person. He'd disrespected an entire institution, a culture, and millions of people who held the royal guards in high regard. The realization hit him hard, though not enough to make him fully grasp the gravity of what he'd done. Not yet, anyway. By the end of the day, Ethan sat alone in his luxurious suite, staring blankly at the glowing screen of his phone. The world outside was buzzing with fury, but inside, there was only silence, and the gnawing sense that he had made a mistake he couldn't undo. The knock on Ethan's hotel room door came late that night, jolting him out of a restless haze. At first, he thought it might be room service, or perhaps one of his few remaining friends trying to check in. But when he opened the door, he was met with two stern-faced officers from the Metropolitan Police. Their badges gleamed under the hallway lights as they introduced themselves and calmly informed him that he was under arrest for vandalism, public disorder, and contempt of court due to the severity of his actions against a national symbol. Ethan's stomach dropped. For a moment, he stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what was happening. "This has to be some kind of misunderstanding," Ethan stammered, clutching the edge of the doorframe like it could steady him. "I didn't hurt anyone." It was just paint. The officers exchanged glances but remained firm. "Sir, please come with us quietly," one of them said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Ethan hesitated, glancing back at the opulent suite behind him. The plush furniture, the minibar stocked with expensive liquor, the view of London's skyline, all the comforts money had bought him. None of it mattered now. With a heavy sigh, he grabbed his jacket and followed them out. At the police station, Ethan sat slumped in a cold, sterile interrogation room, his designer clothes feeling oddly out of place among the stark surroundings. He tried to explain himself, insisting over and over again that it had all been a harmless prank. "I didn't mean any disrespect," he said, his voice tinged with desperation. "It was supposed to be funny. A joke. People do stuff like this all the time." But the detectives listened with blank expressions, their faces unreadable. They asked pointed questions about his intentions, his awareness of British traditions, and whether he understood the significance of the Royal Guards. Each question chipped away at Ethan's confidence, forcing him to confront how little thought he'd actually put into his actions. As the hours dragged on, Ethan began to realize the full weight of his situation. His wealth and status, which had always shielded him in the past, seemed useless here. No amount of money could erase the video that had gone viral, nor could it undo the public outrage that continued to grow by the minute. Even worse, news outlets were reporting live updates on his arrest, speculating about potential charges and jail time. One headline read, "Will money save the rich tourist?" Another boldly declared, "Justice for the guard. Wealth won't protect him now." Ethan felt sick reading those words, knowing they were directed at him. When morning arrived, Ethan was formally charged and released on bail, pending further investigation. As he stepped out of the station, cameras flashed in his face, reporters shouting questions from every direction. "Do you regret your actions? What do you have to say to the guard you humiliated? Are you sorry?" Ethan raised a hand to shield his eyes, overwhelmed by the chaos. He muttered something vague about needing time to reflect before climbing into a waiting car, his chauffeur avoiding eye contact, as if ashamed to be associated with him. Back at his hotel, Ethan poured himself a stiff drink, though it did little to calm his nerves. He scrolled through his phone, dreading the endless stream of vitriol aimed at him. Strangers dissected his life online, his business ventures, his social media presence, even his family background. It was as if the world had decided to tear him apart piece by piece. Worst of all, he learned that James Harper had chosen to press personal charges against him. This wasn't just a legal battle anymore. It was personal. Ethan stared at his reflection in the mirror, barely recognizing the man looking back at him. Gone was the smug, carefree traveler who had strutted through London just days earlier. In his place was someone burdened by shame and uncertainty, grappling with the consequences of his reckless behavior. For the first time in his life, Ethan felt truly powerless and utterly alone. The weeks that followed Ethan's arrest were a blur of legal meetings, media scrutiny, and sleepless nights. His once glamorous life had unraveled into a series of uncomfortable realities he couldn't ignore. Stripped of his sponsors and ostracized by peers who once fawned over him, Ethan found himself navigating uncharted territory, accountability. For the first time in his privileged existence, he was forced to confront the damage his actions had caused, not just to James Harper but to countless others who saw his stunt as an attack on their values and traditions. As part of his bail conditions, Ethan was required to attend mandatory cultural sensitivity classes. At first, he approached them with skepticism, rolling his eyes at the thought of sitting through lectures about respect and empathy. But something unexpected happened during those sessions. The instructor, a soft-spoken woman named Clara, didn't lecture or scold. Instead, she encouraged open dialogue, inviting participants to share personal stories about times they'd felt disrespected or misunderstood. Slowly, Ethan began to listen, really listen, to what people were saying. One session stood out in particular. A young man named Amir, an immigrant from Pakistan, recounted how his family's small business had been vandalized with racist graffiti. "It wasn't just paint on a wall," Amir explained, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "It was a message telling us we didn't belong here." Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the parallels between Amir's story and his own actions hitting him like a punch to the gut. For the first time, he realized that his harmless prank might have carried a similar weight for James and everyone else affected by it. In addition to the classes, Ethan was ordered to complete community service at a local veterans center. At first, he dreaded the assignment, imagining long hours of menial labor under judgmental stares. But again, reality proved different. The veterans welcomed him warmly, sharing stories of sacrifice, duty, and resilience. One veteran, a retired soldier named Henry, took Ethan aside one afternoon after noticing how quiet he'd become. "You look like you're carrying the world on your shoulders," Henry said gently. When Ethan hesitated, Henry added, "Whatever you did, owning up to it is the hardest part." Those words stuck with Ethan. Over time, he started opening up to the veterans, explaining what had led him to pour paint on James and how much regret he now felt. To his surprise, they didn't judge him harshly. Instead, they offered advice, urging him to take responsibility and make amends. Their kindness softened something inside Ethan, chipping away at the arrogance that had defined him for so long. Determined to show genuine remorse, Ethan decided to write a letter to James. It wasn't easy. Every word felt heavy, each sentence fraught with uncertainty. He started by apologizing, not just for the paint, but for failing to understand the significance of James's role. "I treated you like an object instead of a person," Ethan wrote, his pen trembling slightly as he formed the words. "I can't undo what I've done, but I hope you'll believe me when I say I'm truly sorry." He ended the letter by acknowledging James's dignity and strength, expressing admiration for how he'd handled such a difficult situation. Ethan mailed the letter without expecting a response. Days turned into weeks, and though James never replied, Ethan noticed subtle changes in himself. He stopped checking his phone obsessively, no longer seeking validation from likes or comments. Instead, he focused on the small acts of kindness he could offer, helping an elderly neighbor carry groceries, volunteering extra hours at the Veterans Center, even mentoring troubled teens at a local youth program. These gestures weren't grand or flashy, but they gave Ethan a sense of purpose he'd never experienced before. Despite these efforts, Ethan knew forgiveness wouldn't come easily, or perhaps at all. He understood now that apologies weren't magic erasers. They couldn't instantly fix the harm he'd caused. What mattered was the intention behind them, and whether he was willing to change moving forward. As he stood outside the courthouse on the morning of his sentencing, clutching the folder containing character references from the veterans, Ethan felt a strange mix of fear and resolve. He had ruined lives, including his own, but maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance to rebuild. His courtroom was tense as Ethan sat at the defense table, his hands clasped tightly together. The air felt heavy, filled with murmurs from spectators and reporters eager to see how this high-profile case would conclude. Cameras flashed outside, but inside, the atmosphere was somber. Ethan glanced around nervously, taking in the stern faces of the judge, the prosecutor, and even his own lawyer, who had warned him that the outcome depended entirely on how sincere he appeared and whether the court believed he truly changed. When it was time for Ethan to speak, he stood slowly, his legs feeling unsteady beneath him. For weeks, he had rehearsed what he wanted to say. But now, standing before the judge, the carefully crafted words seemed hollow compared to the raw emotion bubbling inside him. Taking a deep breath, he began. "Your Honor, I want to start by saying I am deeply sorry, not just for what I did, but for failing to understand its impact." His voice wavered slightly, but he pressed on. "I thought my actions were harmless, a way to get attention. But I was wrong. So very wrong." Ethan paused, lowering his gaze to the floor. He described the journey he'd been on since his arrest, the cultural sensitivity classes, the community service, and the conversations with veterans who had taught him about sacrifice and respect. I used to think rules didn't apply to me because of where I came from, he admitted, his tone softer now. But I've learned that privilege isn't a free pass. It's a responsibility. And I failed miserably in living up to that. He then turned toward James, who sat quietly in the gallery, flanked by family members. Though James avoided eye contact, Ethan addressed him directly. James, I know nothing I say today can undo the disrespect I showed you. You stood there, proud and dignified, representing something much bigger than yourself, and I treated you like an object. That wasn't fair, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. Ethan's voice cracked as he added, I hope someday you can find it in your heart to forgive me, even if I don't deserve it. The room fell silent after Ethan finished speaking. The judge studied him intently, her expression unreadable. After a long pause, she delivered her verdict. Ethan was fined heavily, a sum so large it wiped out most of his savings, and banned from entering the UK for 5 years. However, thanks to the character references from the Veterans Center and evidence of his rehabilitation efforts, he avoided prison time. As the gavel struck, Ethan exhaled sharply, a mix of relief and shame washing over him. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed him, shouting questions about his sentence and whether he planned to continue making amends. Ethan pushed through the crowd without comment, his head bowed low. When he finally reached his car, he slumped into the seat, letting the weight of everything sink in. He had escaped jail, yes, but the real punishment wasn't behind bars. It was the knowledge that he'd hurt people irreparably and tarnished his own reputation beyond repair. Over the following months, Ethan worked tirelessly to rebuild his life. He sold his luxury apartment and moved into a modest home, using the proceeds to pay off his legal fees and donate to charities supporting military families. He stopped chasing social media fame altogether, deleting his accounts and focusing instead on mentoring young people struggling with entitlement and impulsivity. It wasn't glamorous work, but it gave him a sense of purpose he'd never known before. Meanwhile, James chose not to engage further with Ethan personally, but did agree to participate in interviews discussing the incident. In one particularly poignant segment, James emphasized the importance of mutual respect between citizens and institutions. What happened to me wasn't personal, he said calmly. It was symbolic. Guards like me represent centuries of tradition and service. Disrespecting us disrespects everyone who believes in those values. When asked about Ethan's apology, James simply nodded. I hurt him. Whether I forgive him is between me and my conscience. What matters is that others learn from this. As time passed, both men moved forward in their own ways. Ethan embraced humility, determined to live a quieter, more meaningful life. And James returned to his duties at Buckingham Palace, celebrated not just as a guard, but as a symbol of resilience and grace under pressure. Their paths may never cross again, but their stories remained intertwined, a reminder that actions have consequences, and redemption requires more than just words. Months after the trial, life had settled into a new rhythm for both Ethan and James, though their journeys couldn't have been more different. For Ethan, the days of extravagant parties and endless social media validation were long gone. Instead, he spent his mornings volunteering at a local community center, teaching teenagers about accountability and decision-making. At first, the kids were skeptical of him, a rich guy in designer sneakers trying to lecture them on responsibility. But over time, they warmed up to him. His honesty resonated with them. He didn't sugarcoat his mistakes or pretend he was perfect. Instead, he shared his story openly, using his downfall as a cautionary tale. I thought I was untouchable, he often said during sessions. Turns out, none of us are. Ethan also began writing letters to schools and youth groups, offering to speak about the importance of respecting others, whether it's a person, a culture, or an institution. Some organizations declined his offer, unwilling to forgive his past actions, but others welcomed him. To his surprise, these talks became therapeutic, not just for the audiences, but for himself. Each time he stood in front of a group, admitting his flaws and describing the lessons he'd learned, he felt a little lighter, like he was shedding pieces of the old Ethan Caldwell who thrived on chaos and attention. On the other side of the world, James Harper continued his duties as a royal guard with quiet dignity. The incident with Ethan hadn't shaken his resolve. If anything, it had strengthened it. Every morning, as he polished his boots and straightened his uniform, he reminded himself why he chose this path: to honor his family, his country, and the values he believed in. Though strangers occasionally recognized him and thanked him for handling the situation with grace, James remained humble. "It's not about me," he told anyone who praised him. "It's about what we stand for as a collective." Despite their vastly different lives, there was one moment when their stories intersected again. A journalist approached James, asking if he'd consider meeting Ethan face-to-face for a documentary about forgiveness and redemption. James hesitated before declining politely. "Some things don't need closure," he explained. "What matters is that people learn from what happened. That's enough for me." His answer traveled back to Ethan through mutual acquaintances, leaving him with a sense of peace. James didn't owe him forgiveness, and Ethan no longer expected it. What mattered was the change he was determined to make moving forward. As years passed, Ethan found joy in simple things: cooking dinner for friends, mentoring kids, and walking through parks without feeling the need to document every moment. He even started dating someone, a kind-hearted teacher named Laura, who appreciated him for who he was becoming rather than who he used to be. Their relationship was built on honesty and trust, qualities Ethan had once dismissed as unimportant. Meanwhile, James married his longtime partner, Sarah, and together they welcomed their first child. Life moved on, full of milestones neither man could have predicted during those chaotic days outside Buckingham Palace. The final chapter of their intertwined stories came unexpectedly when Ethan stumbled upon a charity gala honoring military families. As he scrolled through the guest list online, one name caught his eye: James Harper. It turned out James had been invited to receive an award for his exemplary service and resilience. Ethan debated attending but ultimately decided against it. Instead, he sent a heartfelt note congratulating James and thanking him for enduring the humiliation with such composure and for inspiring countless people, including Ethan himself, to strive for better. James read the note privately, folding it neatly and tucking it away. He didn't respond, nor did he mention it to anyone. But later that evening, as he held his newborn daughter in his arms, he allowed himself a small smile. Perhaps forgiveness wasn't about forgetting or excusing what happened. Maybe it was about recognizing growth in others and in oneself, and choosing to focus on the good that could come from even the darkest moments. And so their paths diverged once more, each man carrying the lessons of that fateful day in London. Ethan lived humbly, striving daily to be someone worthy of respect. James carried on proudly, embodying the traditions he cherished while embracing the future ahead. Together, their stories served as a reminder that everyone makes mistakes, but true strength lies in how we rise after falling.